So I'd like to welcome Toby Jones, who is an assistant professor at Rutgers University, and is going to be coming to join the Northeast Consortium for Middle Eastern Studies in Cleveland here on December 15th and 16th. Toby is a historian, but makes frequent interventions into the policy world. He's best known for his work on Saudi Arabia in the Persian Gulf, in particular Bahrain, and discusses the role of oil and water in Saudi Arabia, and is now working on a second book also, which will be coming out with Harvard University Press, on oil and the wages of oil in the world. We'd like to welcome you, Toby. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Josh.
The first question we'd like to ask is sort of on sectarianism in the Middle East. This is a question that, as Middle East experts will well know, gets brought up almost any time you say that you work on the Middle East. I guess if you could address the sort of broad community, could you explain very quickly the doctrinal differences between Sunni and Shia Islam, as well as why what's a better way or a more useful way of understanding sectarianism in the politics of Iraq, the Gulf, and the broader Middle East? How do we make sense of this?
It's an important question, and certainly since the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the unleashing of certain kinds of what have been identified as sectarian, particularly Shia on Sunni violence or Sunni on Shia violence, it's become kind of a pressing concern, and how to make sense of it, and how to make sense of these dynamics and in the contemporary region, and what it means not only for people there, but also for American policymakers is obviously important. Just start with the historical dimension. Islam emerged in the 7th century. I think many people will be familiar with that. But almost immediately, within several generations, there was a doctrinal split, questions about political succession, questions about religious leadership, and who in the community followed who, became matters of contention and confrontation. And so the Muslim community split very early on about who should succeed Muhammad the Prophet as his most immediate successor, and then down the line. Over time, those differences of agreement hardened into two schools of sort of interpretation or thought, known as Sunnism and Shiism. They've sort of developed certain kinds of accretions, institutional, juridical, legal, cultural, and even theological over time, and the differences have become hardened. Now, the demographic realities are that if we think of the Muslim world globally, encompassing not only the Arab world, but also parts of South Asia, Central Asia, Africa, and even important parts of the West, large parts of the West, a lot of folks, Shiis represent probably somewhere between 15 and 20% of the total number of Muslims. So Sunnis have historically and continue to be, they tend to be, sort of the majority in terms of, makeup. But even within both of those communities, within Shiism and within Sunnism, there are varieties of belief and interpretation. Now, over time, and one mistake that we make as observers, particularly those who have little experience in the region, or who are attracted to simple explanations for why politics, in particular, work a certain way, or immediately sort of, drawn to questions of religious difference as a way to explain political contention and political conflict. This was most clear in Iraq when there was, in fact, a sectarian civil war. So we assume that over time that these differences of legal tradition, of religious tradition, and religious interpretation have manifested in conflict and have framed a certain kind of hostility between Muslims and between outsiders and between all kinds of folks. But one of the things that I try to do in my scholarship and that others have tried to do is to draw a very careful distinction and to make clear that differences in philosophy, differences in religious observance, and even religious identity have not always manifested in religious conflict. The fact that Shiis and Sunnis took aim at each other in Iraq after 2003, or even today in the Persian Gulf in places like Bahrain or Saudi Arabia, and even violence between Muslim and non-Muslim communities like the Christian community in Egypt and the Muslim community there, are largely the product of contemporary political concerns. These are not timeless conflicts. Although both of these or all of these relationships have long histories, and perhaps over time they've been fraught or problematic, the reality is that the very violent kind of the paroxysms of violence that we've seen in lots of places have much more to do with sort of institutional, political, and more global kinds of historical change that have occurred over the last 100 years. So let's take Iraq, for example. A place that was born in the aftermath of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I, created by the British. There were elements of connection between various Iraqi communities, but Iraqis didn't primarily see themselves in religious terms. They saw themselves as subjects of the Ottoman Empire, and then after 1920 as subjects of a colonial state that many of them bristled against. It just so happened that the British had an interest in creating a manageable place, and they sought to do so by empowering a religious minority at the expense of the majority. That happened to be the Sunni community. And then the British built a state around a small group of Sunni former Ottoman military elites and empowered them at the expense of Shiite peasants, Shiite clerics. Over the course of the 20th century, this pattern of institutional and political authority persisted, and it became more exacerbated under regimes like Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath regime, in which Shiism became synonymous with being an outsider or being an internal threat. It wasn't until the 1990s, in spite of a couple of decades of trying, that sectarianism in its most identifiable forms there became a real factor in political life, where animosity between Shias and Sunnis became most pronounced, and this was largely the consequence of Desert Storm and the U.S. decision to throw Saddam out of Kuwait in 1991. So contemporary sectarianism, particularly its most violent manifestations in that place, and then the very pronounced and difficult and violent bloody war, civil war between Shias and Sunnis in Iraq after the American invasion, is the consequence not so much of a 7th century disagreement about doctrine and political succession, as it is the consequence of a colonial experiment that sought to serve the interests of empire, capitalism, and all kinds of other forces that were imposed on the region. And the same can be true across much of the rest of the region, whether it's in the Persian Gulf, or whether it's in Syria, or even whether it's in Egypt.
It sounds like there are these, in many senses, sectarianism, or this sort of timeless sectarianism, is a bit of a straw man that gets imposed when actually other powers are sort of intervening economically, militarily into these places. It's an easy way to hold that up. That's a very clear explanation and very helpful. In terms of, another misconception I think many Americans have is they don't really understand the nuances between the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States. I know in your first book you dealt with this a good bit. Robert Vitalis has dealt with it in his book America's Kingdom. What would you like sort of the population or wider audience to know about the U.S.-Saudi relationship, when so many tend to look at the way that the Saudi ruling family dresses or rules, and then how American political elite dress and rule, and say like, well, they're so different. So how can that relationship be sustained? And how is that relationship being reimagined or reshaped as a consequence of the uprisings that we've seen in the Arab Spring?
The American-Saudi relationship has been an object of attention for quite a long time, and it's certainly been important to both Saudi and American political elites. It's also been important to a group of observers, whether they're academic or otherwise, who have tried to make sense of this. There's a conventional wisdom about the relationship that says that it essentially boils down to a strategic relationship in which Saudi Arabia provides cheap oil in exchange for American security assurances. And this works at a certain level. It's certainly true that the Americans have prioritized Saudi Arabia's energy resources, its oil and other hydrocarbon resources, more recently natural gas, as important, both critical to the American economy, but also important to the global economy. And in the context of the Cold War, sort of framed a certain approach to thinking about how to deal with global rivalry and what was important to protect in order to have leverage over allies and enemies, or at least rivals. So the energy dimension has been important, and the American security dimension has also been important. But this isn't the entirety of the relationship. In fact, it boils things down to a frame of national security, particularly from the perspective of the Americans, that doesn't quite get at the true scope of American engagement, or that the role that the United States and that American actors, not just the American government, but everything from American oil companies to American experts, played in building a particular kind of political order in Saudi Arabia. So if we set aside questions of national security and say, well, what exactly has the relationship between the Saudis and the Americans been historically? Well, the relationship first took shape in the early 1930s on its most concrete forms when American philanthropists and entrepreneurs went to the kingdom looking for all kinds of things, looking for mineral resources, but also looking to establish profitable relationships and to serve the interests of a family, the El Saud, that was struggling to maintain control over what really geographically is quite a large place. The contemporary Saudi Arabia and the Arabian Peninsula in which it's a part is about a third the size of the United States, so it's very large. By the early 1930s, it became clear to a group of American geologists that Saudi Arabia was going to be home to significant oil deposits, and that turned out to be true by 1938. An American oil conglomerate by the name Aramco, the Arabian American Oil Company, discovered commercial quantities of oil along the Persian Gulf coast. So, in some sense, the relationship between Saudi's energy ability, its producing capacity, and the way the Americans would come to think about national security and how oil fit in all of that began in the early 1930s. So that's only part of the story, as I've already suggested. Saudi Arabia was a fledgling state in the first third of the 20th century, and sought to build up its institutional capacity and so on. And the Americans of various varieties, from the oil companies to experts to the government, began playing a central role in building the institutions of governance, of helping develop a national economy, of bridging markets, creating connections between communities, and basically creating what we would identify as the modern Saudi state, complete with all of its bureaucratic accretions and all of the institutions that mark it out as a state like any other. And it should be thought in that way. I know lots of folks want to consider Saudi Arabia as an exceptional place, but it's really not. It's pretty normal, especially for post-colonial states. But this is important in the context of the Arab Spring, and it's important in the context of the kind of political convulsions that shake the region now. Saudi Arabia, by the 1940s and 1950s, was very clearly going to be an autocratic state in which power was consolidated in the hands of a very few political elites. And the Americans participated. And when I say the Americans, I mean everybody from Aramco to American policymakers to military leaders decided that stability in Saudi Arabia, creating a sort of an empowered, small, oligarchical class of ruling elites that could manage both energy resources and this large chunk of territory were consistent with American interests in both the context of the Cold War, but also its emerging dependence on foreign oil by the 1960s and 1970s. So the Americans played a fundamental role in helping build an autocratic political order in Saudi Arabia in various ways. This may come as probably no shock to a lot of folks that the Americans privileged stability and the security of these kinds of regimes over other kinds of political sort of arrangements, whether they be democratic or otherwise. But the reality is that in Saudi Arabia in the 1950s, there was a real democratic possibility. There were arguments in favor of constitutional monarchy. There were arguments in favor of more distributed forms of power. In the United States and American oil firms worked to undermine that. In the interests, or in their interests. Now, why does that matter? Well, it matters in a number of different ways. I mentioned the Arab Spring. I'll come back to that in just a moment. It matters in part because it created a legacy for lots of Arabs, not only in Saudi Arabia, but around the Gulf, in which the United States clearly didn't privilege its values in the Middle East. The United States is going to talk about democratic rights, democratic possibilities. It actively worked to undermine precisely that possibility in a place like Saudi Arabia at mid-century. People remember that. And when they think about transition, and when they think about contemporary politics, and when we worry about whether or not these places are going to align with us, we have to come face to face with the reality that we don't have a great track record in places like the Middle East in promoting political pluralism or participation, women's rights, or other kinds of things. In the context of the Arab Spring, the question comes up again that from Tunisia to Egypt, Bahrain, Yemen, and Syria, publics across the region have made clear that they've grown tired of decades of autocratic and tyrannical rule and have taken to the streets. We're now in an era of mass politics, and with Arab publics, in which Arab publics are demanding concessions, and they're throwing off the yoke of an old, kind of cumbersome, corrupt political order. One place that seems to have remained untouched is Saudi Arabia. And it's true. Saudi Arabia has not seen the kinds of street protests that have rocked regimes elsewhere, although it was concerned with the uprising in Bahrain and even sent military forces there. But it's instructive that the United States, although it has not responded, I don't think, in a way that's particularly consistent across the region, has been almost silent on the question of democratic possibilities in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and elsewhere in the Persian Gulf. And in fact, it remains true that the United States prefers, and here we're talking about American policymakers more than American oil companies, but American policymakers clearly prefer to preserve the political status quo in Saudi Arabia, have no interest in seeing democratic transition there, or in those satellite states like Bahrain, where we've also identified strategic interests. And that's interesting. We want to, critics of the American handling of the Arab Spring want to argue that, in fact, there's a double standard, that we advocated for the fall of Gaddafi in Libya, we were late to the game in Egypt, but ultimately supported and called for Mubarak to step down, have augured for Ali Abdullah Saleh in Yemen to step down and put pressure on Assad, whereas in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, we've protected the status quo, and that represents something of a double standard. Well, in fact, historically, it's entirely consistent with American interests, that we don't want to see democratic change in those places. But the question before the Americans and before the Saudis is how stable are these sets of arrangements? How long can those political systems endure in an era of mass politics? And will the Americans, will the Saudis, will the Bahrainis be forced to reckon with an even more highly mobilized and confrontational set of revolutionary forces going forward?
Based on what you said, and I think you're going to get a lot of attention when you come to Cleveland because people are going to be really interested in this issue. But also, like the way you just presented it, it's not a one-way relationship where the United States sort of has to deal with this sort of unchangeable, pretty nasty regime, but it's actually sort of stitched itself into that relationship in a way that structurally benefits both sides to behave in the political manners in which they do. So that's an excellent way to go about that, understanding that in a nuanced way. If we could turn to your new project in this book on oil wars, again, most people out in Middle America, their only sort of intersection with oil is how much they're paying for gasoline for their cars, and I don't think people have a very nuanced understanding of just how valuable a commodity oil is and how it's a resource that will induce a lot of conflict. Can you talk a little bit about the connection between oil, energy, security, and the American role in the Middle East? And then also as a sort of follow-up to that, why has oil been such an engine for conflict?
Right. Well, in part, it builds on this discussion of the U.S.-Saudi relationship. If we take that relationship as a lens to understand oil and its connection to regional and global conflict, I think it becomes instructive. But let me back up a little bit and sort of outline what I think the central argument of this new project is. One of the things I think we can identify is that once oil becomes linked to American national security, and in fact they become synonymous in a certain that conflict ultimately, as a historian, it ultimately became inevitable. And there's a couple of reasons why. One is that by aligning with regimes like Saudi Arabia, like the Shah in Iran, and like other autocracies across the region, oil-producing autocracies, whether they be in Kuwait, Bahrain, or elsewhere, and the Arab Spring has made all of these clear, is that I happen to believe that these regimes have become, over time, inherently unstable. That's a problem for Arab publics and for the regimes themselves, particularly this revolutionary moment. It has partly to do with the nature of their political systems, but it also has partly to do with the way the United States has cultivated relationships with them. So the Americans began most clearly, it really is in the late 1960s, when the United States begins to identify oil and national security in a particular way. And the policy implications for that would become most pronounced in 1968 and in the decades that followed. And what happened is that the United States began to believe that oil became so precious a commodity that it needed to use various kinds of military power to protect it. Mm-hmm. In the 1960s and 1970s, this took shape in the form of what's called the Twin Pillar policy, in which the Americans aligned closely with Iran and Saudi Arabia and began selling weapons at incredible amounts, billions of dollars of weapons to both regimes, with the understanding that they would serve as our proxies in the region. Well, signaling back to this earlier comment that these regimes were unstable. Once they're highly militarized and they possess the capacity for great violence, but they are also oppressive at home, we begin to see sort of the emergence of contradictions and tensions in places like Iran and Saudi Arabia, where communities become restive. And this sort of manifested most clearly in Iran in 1977, 1978, 1979, when Iran experienced the region's first revolution. Iranians threw the Shah out of power, and of course, sort of were familiar, I think, generally, the kind of political regime that followed, the sorts of problems that created for the United States. So part of the oil wars argument is to take a long look and to locate the origins of a particular moment when the United States decides that military force and certain kinds of violence and the selling of weapons becomes the policy of choice. And then what are the consequences of that? And its beginnings are in the 1960s and the 1970s. But inherently to the strategy are not indications of American strength, but rather indications of American weakness. Once the Shah falls and the Islamic Republic takes over in Iran, what we see is an accelerated era from the mid-1980s in the context of the Iran-Iraq War through 1990, 1991, over the course of the 1990s and even 2003. When the United States transitions away from just selling weapons to projecting its own military forces in the region, right? So arguably we fire our first shot in Desert Storm, not in 1991, not even in 1990, but sometime in the late 1980s, when we become an active backer of Iraq in the Iran-Iraq War. And from that moment on, our fate is sealed. The commitment to using military force, to building up military resources, to protect oil, and this is what it's all based upon, to protect the flow of oil, is secured. And from then we see sort of the dramatic intensification and expansion of the American military footprint in the region. So how did this happen? Is part of the question that I have. One, it has to do with a strategic decision made in the 1960s and 1970s, but it's really embodied most perfectly in an address that Jimmy Carter made in the aftermath of both the fall of the Shah, but also the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979. Carter followed all of that up in an address before the United States in his State of the Union speech, in which he outlined a new strategic doctrine, in which he identified oil as one of the United States' vital interests and made the commitment that the United States would use all means necessary, including military force, to protect it. So that becomes very clear in the context of the Iran-Iraq War and what would follow. So we transition away from selling weapons and proxy wars to becoming militarily engaged. And what I want to understand is the role that oil plays in all of this. Why is it that we're committed to this trajectory? Carter said in his doctrine, or in his strategic vision, he said that it had to do with the need to protect the flow of oil. And that was literally built in to his comments and to his statement, in which he outlined what's called the Carter Doctrine. The argument goes something like this, that because oil is a scarce resource, because the gap between global supply and global demand is arguably very tight, that we have to do everything necessary to protect the flow of this precious commodity, lest it fall in the hands of the Soviets, or lest it fall under the influence of other global actors that may have interests that are inimical to ours. We have to protect it. That's the conventional wisdom about the political economy of oil. Well, part of what my book, what my project, America's Oil Wars, seeks to do is to reconsider this political economy. It's become an article of faith that we believe oil is a scarce resource. But what if it's not? What if, in fact, there's plenty of global supply? What would be the consequences of that? Now, I happen to believe that you can make the case, and I think if you pay any attention to the news over the last few weeks, you see that with the production of certain kinds of shale oil, natural gas, a boom in natural gas production, as well as the discovery of new petroleum deposits, that we're not actually in an era of scarcity at all. We're in an era of oil abundance. And we have to be careful when we make this case, because there are all kinds of deleterious consequences for being dependent on oil. Some have to do with climate change and the environment more generally. Sort of heavy carbon consumption is not good for the planet. But in terms of political economy, in American strategic doctrine and our approach to national security in the Persian Gulf, if in fact oil is not a scarce resource, then the entire premise upon which Carter outlined his doctrine, and upon which subsequent wars in the region were fought, not to secure direct access or to control the oil fields of Iraq or Kuwait, but to make sure that those producers could get oil to global markets, is wrong. In fact, there's plenty of oil, and if we don't have to protect it militarily, the burden then falls on those regimes to actually participate in a global market. And if they have to sell their oil more than we have to buy it. So the consequences of all of this are really quite remarkable. If in fact oil is not a scarce resource, and there's plenty of it, well, prices have skyrocketed in spite of there not being scarcity. And we fought a series of wars in order to protect the flow when we don't actually have to do so. So you can see that the potential consequences of this could be quite dramatic. It provides an argument for withdrawing our military resources and reducing our military footprint, for not providing aid to certain kinds of autocratic regimes which wage war on their own citizens, and for moving all of those resources in more productive places. And frankly, for finding better ways to use the existing deposits and petroleum reserves that we have.
As we can see, we have plenty to talk about when you're going to be here in about 10 days, and we're really looking forward to having you as the third NOCMIS speaker, and Cleveland is going to be ready to receive you very warmly, and I suspect the events are going to sell out quite quickly. So thanks for taking the time to do this pre-interview with us. And again, we were talking with Toby Jones, who's an assistant professor at Rutgers University, who will be speaking here at Trinity Cathedral on December 15th, and then at the City Club on Friday, December 16th on their Friday Forum. My name is John Stacher. I'm an assistant professor at Kent State and a member of the NOCMIS Consortium. We look forward to seeing you in Cleveland.